Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Glaser, and I'm a Canadian composer. Then again, what does that mean? The fact is, as a nation, we have no idea who we are. And this situation is fairly unique in the world. When we think of Canada, we think of maple syrup, hockey, or cold winters. But these trivial factors really tell us nothing about who we are. Some people have tried to address this problem. Margaret Atwood has said that we are too preoccupied with surviving in this harsh climate to deal with things like culture. The author Jan Martel has said that Canada's a hotel for all nations to live in, but not really call a home. I don't know, maybe we're just too preoccupied with building pipelines for big business. So then, for the past 6 months, I have been writing the Great Canadian Symphony, a work that will capture the hearts and minds of the young generation of Canadians and finally solve the mysterious nature of the Canadian identity. Great. Now, how do I do that? There are several problems with creating a Canadian piece. The first is, to create a Canadian piece, you need to work out what Canada is. And then, you need to translate that into music. So let's go on a journey. Let's find out what goes in to writing that great Canadian symphony. Over the summer, I took a course here at UBC, taught by Professor Richard Cavell. This course served to provide links between literature, sexuality, and Canadian nationalism. Great, I thought. All I need to do is substitute literature for music, and I have my answer. But it's not so simple. In the course, we looked at 3 different theories of identity: essentialism, constructivism, and performativity. Now, why would I turn to sexual theories of identity? It's because these theories tend to be the most advanced when talking about identity. And as Nick said, our sexuality is so much a part of who we are that it's often hard to separate the two. So let's start with essentialism. Essentialism is the theory set out by Freud that our sexualities are a natural part of our being. That it's a leftover from a thing for culture. That our sexuality is part of our essential self. Okay, so can we apply this to nationality? Yes, and many have. The idea there being that you can find a nation's essential nature by looking at its folk and primitive past. Okay, so can we apply this to music? Yes, and again, many have. Many composers of the early modernist period were concerned with doing exactly that, none more so than the composer Bela Bartok. Bartok collected volumes of folk music to study its idiosyncrasies and create a Hungarian national music. The composer Leos Janáček even went so far as to transcribe his native Czech into musical notation. So does this work with Canada? I'm going to take this folk song. You may have heard of it, Alouette. I'm going to create a Canadian piece, right here. If you'll excuse my piano playing, sorry. So that's how a 19th century nationalist might harmonize it and can call it fantasy on a Canadian folk song, or Canadian folk dances, or even songs of my people. If I wanted to be a bit more modern, I might harmonize it rather than with those chords, those dinky sounding chords, then with fifths or fourths, to represent, as the American composer Aaron Copland did, the vast empty landscapes of our country. So let's see what that sounds like. So there, they have a Canadian piece. It's modern and entirely Canadian. But did that resonate with you? First of all, I'm playing a Quebecois folk song for a British Columbian audience. So is that really the songs of your people? Okay, so scrap the folk song. We've still got that empty landscape stuff, right? The fifths and the fourths and stuff like that. Oh yeah. So I wrote this piece. This piece is a musical evocation of the geography surrounding Vancouver. These trumpets you see here, or here, are the mountains. Then we get a section that describes the ocean. And towards the end, we get both together, just like right outside. But all this talk about mountains and oceans, it's really rather local, isn't it? After all, what does someone from Saskatchewan know about mountains and oceans? And if we're talking about essentialism here, so we're talking about our primitive selves. And an essentialist would say that this scenery doesn't even belong to me. Because after all, aside from our native population, we're all immigrants here. So can we really lay a claim to the land? So that's problematic. So we move on to the theories of Michel Foucault, termed constructivism. Constructivism is the belief that our sexualities are not a natural part of ourselves. They're rather informed by our own discourse on sexuality. So can we apply this to nationality? Yeah, but it's harder. One thing Richard Cavell was trying to do in that course was exactly that. I actually find this easier to explain in terms of music than I do in terms of nationality. The idea being that to create Canadian music, you must rely on the history of Canadian music. And believe it or not, there actually is a history of Canadian art music. And then no, it has nothing to do with Justin Bieber. In my research, I've come across 3 different styles of Canadian composition. A Montreal style, a Toronto style, and a Vancouver style. The 3 major population centers, and it just so happens to be the 3 places in which I've lived. Entirely coincidental. The Toronto style is marked by a reverence for American serialism, the systematic use of all 12 tones of the chromatic scale. But the Toronto composers, Harry Summers and John Weitzweig, don't always hold to the model of the rigid model of serialism. They often break it to include quotations or evoke the style of Canadian folk songs. The Montreal composers, Jacques Hétu and Claude Vivier, to name 2, are understandably influenced more by the French composers and turn more to sound itself as the basis of their compositions. And the Vancouver composers, centered around Jean Coulthard, are more concerned with pieces that are just simply beautiful. So if the future of Canadian composition relies on its past, then it stands to reason that a new Canadian work will combine the characteristics of all 3. And I think I've done that in my piano piece, Reflections. The piece starts out with this sonically exploratory section. I'm channeling the Montreal school here and exploring the properties of this sound. The next section is contrasting, then it takes more cues from the Vancouver style. We've got a pretty melody in thirds on top. We've got some of those open fifths at the bottom. You remember those empty landscapes, right? The section after this, the central section of the work, is a systematic Torontonian deconstruction of that single chord. Still, I'm not convinced. Because doesn't that sound forced? I seem so concerned with fitting into a Canadian mold of composition that the style of the piece is really kind of an exercise in nationalism than it is really any true representation of my voice as a composer. So we move on. The next theory is Judith Butler's performativity. Now, Judith Butler says, you know what? Our sexuality is not, it's not this natural part of ourselves. It's not really informed by our discourse, really. Even Foucault said himself that all of these discourses serve to regulate us into one of these discussed categories. So Judith Butler says, you know what? It's not about either of those things. It's about what we do. It's our actions. People can perform in styles. There's a heterosexual style, a homosexual style, but our view of ourselves are constantly being redefined by every action that we perform. So can we apply this to nationality? I would say yes. But the big question there is what does a nation perform? And to that I would say a nation performs art. All the great nations of history are remembered for their art. And a history of the world is really, in a lot of ways, a history of art. So, as an example, let's take my symphony, finally. This is the main theme of the entire work. Now that's not a Montreal-style piece. It's not a Toronto-style piece. It's not even a Vancouver-style piece, really, and there's no perfect fifth to be found anywhere. But it's entirely me. And I'm a product of Canada. So this piece, in essence, is the intellectual offspring of Canada, and thus serves to define it. So it seems I've had the question backwards the entire time. It's not about making my music definably Canadian, but it's that my music really defines what Canada is. In this way, art shows us who we are. Thank you.